So I'm going to talk about immigration policy after Brexit. I'm not going to say a lot, although I'm happy to mention and to ask questions about what precisely might be in future trade agreements outside the EU on immigration policy, because I think the short answer is that in the short to medium term, the UK has not thought at all about this subject, except to the extent of ruling some things out, and we already saw that, of course, in the Prime Minister's trip to India, when the Indians made clear that a precondition for any sort of serious negotiations about an India-UK trade agreement was the same as the Indians' preconditions for any sort of serious talk about an India-EU free trade agreement, which is that migration policy and at least the movement of highly skilled workers for the purpose of delivering services had to be a significant part of the agenda. And they also made clear that they were not terribly happy about the way that the UK treated Indians applying to study here. The Prime Minister essentially was not interested in talking about this, and the result is that India-UK trade relations, as some of us predicted before the referendum, are going nowhere quite slowly in the short to medium term. So I do not think this is going to be a major subject for the UK in the immediate future. It may at some point down the line. I'll say a few words about it later. But I'm going to start by talking more broadly about UK immigration policy, how it might evolve, and how that will tie into our future relationship with the EU. So, first of all, what's the current system? We have very much a two-tier system. We have free movement for EEA citizens. They have the right not just to move for work, but to seek work, to be self-employed, or if they're self-supporting. There are some limited restrictions in theory and some even more limited restrictions, which is to say virtually no restrictions at all in practice for people from other EE member states coming here. By contrast, for people coming here for work purposes from outside the EEA, there are some pretty tightly regulated restrictions. The main route is something called the Tier 2 route. For skilled workers, there is a quota and there are salary and qualification restrictions. There is also a small list of shortage occupations. Separately, but also within Tier 2, there are inter-company transfers, for which there are no quota and which are a lot easier to get, but for which there is a very high salary threshold. There are also provisions for people coming from outside the EU under other routes. So what then are the options for the new system? And I think there are three, at least before the referendum, there were sort of three possible options for a post-Brexit immigration system that were on the table. Let me go through each of them. So this was the vote leave proposal. No discrimination was the key element. That is to say, people from anywhere outside the UK would be treated the same wherever they came from. And the system would be points-based. It would be based on skills or some measures of human capital. Now, the Prime Minister very quickly, after the election, ruled that out. She said she didn't like the Australian system. She didn't think that this human capital-based approach, she didn't quite use those words, but she essentially said that was not the right way for an immigration system for a country like the UK to go, and she essentially ruled that out. The second type of system you might look at is something that I would describe as modified free movement. That is, that attempted to preserve the very current degree of labour mobility that exists between the UK and the rest of Europe, but while putting various restrictions on it that made it much more clearly that it was about free movement of workers, not about persons, and that attempt to address what some people thought were the main issues that at least some of the electorate were worried about, that is, people coming without a job, benefit tourism and the like. So what would this look like? Well, there are various elements that you could imagine being part of this, these type of arrangements. First of all, you could have something that's like the current EEA arrangements that apply, for example, to Norway, where there is an emergency break, that is an overall limit on work-related migration that can be invoked in particular circumstances. The Norwegians have not in practice ever tried to invoke this. but it's at least a theoretical possibility. It was one of the things that the Prime Minister was at one point in his renegotiation looking for. Second set of things, restrictions on labour market access. For example, you might need a job offer in order to exercise free movement, or there might be national preference for UK citizens as opposed to EA citizens in some circumstances. Now, this is what the Swiss are introducing in response to the referendum decision in Switzerland to introduce a quota for EEA nationals. The EU told the Swiss in no uncertain terms that was not on, and if they tried to do that, they were going to be kicked out of the single market. The Swiss, in response to this, have essentially backed down, but they have, after tortuous negotiations with the EU, agreed that they may be allowed, in some particular and pretty limited circumstances, be allowed to exercise national preference. This is a bit of a fig leaf, I think, frankly. But you can imagine these sorts of restrictions applying if the UK was outside the EU. And finally, restrictions on access to benefits to public services. Of course, the Prime Minister did get some of this in his renegotiation, but you can imagine going a bit farther. Now, all of these, I think, were we looking to negotiate a very deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU, and what I think you'll be thinking about here is what you might call EA minus. In other words, I don't think we could call it the EA for various political reasons, but if you said we were essentially trying to negotiate a UK-specific version of the EEA, which involves a considerable degree of single market access across the board, probably some sort of treaty-based arrangement, as the EA has, and some sort of treaty-based dispute resolution settlement. And this, of course, relates to quite a bit of the sort of thing that that Tom was talking about and that Angus mentioned and has mentioned before. Then you can imagine that this sort of modified free movement, somewhere not at the level of Norway or Switzerland, but a step behind, but still essentially free movement, might be very well be part of those negotiations. I think it is pretty clear that that is not the current UK direction of travel. Ruling out, the Prime Minister said very clearly that we are going to have control of our own immigration policy. We are going to make policy, and that we're not going to be subject to the European Court of Justice or European judges. Now, neither of those two things formally and completely rules out the sort of arrangement that is described here. But I think it certainly, if not in letter, in spirit, would violate what I think the Prime Minister is trying to achieve and what she's promised to the British people. So at the moment, I think this is not what's on the agenda. But of course, it is the sort of thing that you can imagine coming back on the agenda over the next 2 years if politics takes a particular turn. And as we've seen, I think, in the last 2 years, one should be very reluctant to make two forecasts that are too definitive about scenarios in this respect. So I don't think this is where we're headed, but it doesn't mean we won't be where we end up. And finally, and this is where we are headed at the moment, you can imagine some modification of the current work permit scheme. So this is a brief description of the current system, which is very complicated for people from outside the EU. As I said, thresholds, some shortage occupations, an overall quota for skilled workers, intra-company transfers without a quota. The basic point here is that the system is expensive, it's bureaucratic, it is manageable if you're a large company, it's not really manageable if you're a small company. So then, if we were to move to try and extend this current system to post-Brexit Britain, what would it look like? So what are the key outstanding issues? And these, I think, are the main ones for me. First of all, are we going to try and modify the existing system, or are we going to go to a quite different system in terms of what the processes and procedures actually look like? The advantage of the former is that, well, the current system may not work perfectly, but it is there. The Home Office does know how to work it. Large companies at least know how to work it. The disadvantage, as I said, it's expensive, it's bureaucratic, it really only works for large companies, and it may or may not be capable of being scaled up to the sort of volumes which would be required. Second set of issues, not yet, I think, even remotely near to being decided what the level and scope of any overall quotas would be. The third, and this is the key one and the one that ties into the negotiations, is will there be European preference in this new system? In other words, Are we going to have a non-discriminatory system? Or are we going to have a system where there is some preference still for either EU or EEA nationals vis-a-vis non-EU or non-EU nationals? And this seems to me, this is a very important question. It's very much up in the air. And what's not clear at all is whether this will in fact be part of the negotiations. It is quite unclear, I think, at the moment whether immigration policy is something that we want to be negotiating about at all. And it's not clear to me whether it's something that other EU countries want to be negotiating about at all either. The Prime Minister said she wants us to have control over our own system. That sort of implies that whatever there will be in any trade new agreement is not going to have much, if anything, about migration. Equally, from the point of view of EU member states, they've made their position quite clear. Either you're in the single market, which includes free movement, or you're out. If you're not interested in free movement, you're out. The logical consequence of that is that whatever we're going to be talking about is not the single market, and it doesn't include free movement, and there's no particular reason to have any detailed discussions about migration. There is a view among some people, it appears to me to be a view among some politicians or something, that there's something we can offer here. We can offer European preference, and in return, the Europeans will be inclined to give us something more on other aspects of trade deals. It's far from clear to me that is why that should be the case. It is not clear to me why if we go to the governments of Poland and Latvia and say, well, we're talking about this new trade deal. Here's a really big concession we're prepared to make. We are still prepared to take your doctors, your skilled engineers, and your university professors. We just don't want your builders and your cleaning ladies. It is not clear to me that that buys us anything, quite frankly. So if I had to bet at this point, my bet is that that this will not be a major topic in the negotiations. But that remains to be seen. And as we say, a lot can happen in 18 months. Finally, again, very much up in the air, sector-based schemes. The current work permit scheme is not a sector-based scheme. There are shortage occupations, but there are occupations, not sectors, and they cover only a very small proportion of overall skilled migration. But there has been a lot of talk about sector-based schemes for agriculture, implicitly for finance, perhaps for other sectors like food manufacturing, hospitality, who knows. Every sector, of course, probably, if you ask them, will say, we need a scheme. The government has not made its position clear, quite rightly so, and I think there are some big pros and cons. On the pro side, sector-based schemes does let you respond to this sectoral lobbying and lets you address the needs of individual sectors, and in principle, if you have an industrial strategy, which we're going to be talking about later, it could somehow support this industrial strategy. It might also, in some ways, be less bureaucratic. There are some big cons, in my views. In my view, it essentially, the sectoral lobbying, of course, is a con as well as a pro. And in particular, to do it properly, it requires a degree of central planning of the UK labour market and Whitehall capacity to do that central planning, which, frankly, I do not believe, and I don't think any of my former colleagues in Whitehall believe, Whitehall really is capable of doing. There are huge administrative issues. We used to have a sector-based scheme for agriculture. It worked quite well. But basically, what happened there was gangmasters brought over people, accommodated them in fields in Lincolnshire, and hired them out to farmers. That is not going to work in the financial sector. It's not going to work for pret-a-manger either. The administrative issues here, I think, are quite challenging. Finally, how long have I got? Not very long. 1 minute. 1 minute. Two really important points I always make. First of all, ending free movement is not about border control. We will not be controlling Europeans coming for work purposes at the borders any more than we control Americans or Australians coming for work purposes at the borders in any meaningful sense. Control will be, as it is now for Americans, at the workplace. That is the big difference. So when we say we're ending free movement, we're not going to be ending free movement. What we are is going to be putting on employers a huge degree of extra responsibility to ensure that the Europeans working for them are not only here legally, but have the legal right to work. That is going to be a very significant increase in bureaucracy and enforcement. This really, really, really matters to business, especially small business. And it cannot be said often enough. This is not really about what happens at the borders is very important, but free movement of workers is not really about the borders. I'm not going to skip that. Finally, something that's been a lot in the news, but I talked about 6 months ago why this was going to be a mess. Transitional issues for resident EU citizens. The basic point is here, there are 3 million people here. We've made a political commitment, and I'm sure that will in some way be fulfilled to let them stay. We don't know who they are. There is no population register. There's no database of entries and exits. The 3 million estimate comes from survey evidence. We are going to have to come up with we know the current system for giving permanent residence is not remotely fit for purpose for dealing with this. We need a new system. We need to start thinking about how that new system is going to work now. But whatever we do, there's going to be this long period of uncertainty, which is going to be hard for individuals and bad for business. So the conclusion, what do I think is going to happen? And this is rather downbeat. We are going to increase regulation and the size of the state. We are going to reduce flows of both skilled and unskilled workers. How much damage we do, though, how big those impacts will depend on how open or closed the new system is and how it is administered. And we're a very long way from learning what that's going to look like. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Johnson.